I'll start this last segment off with what I think is one of the best titles of all time for a sociological article. It's an article from the early 1990s, and the beginning of the title was called Anything But Heavy Metal. Now that seems like a strange place to start here, but in this section I want to talk a little bit about what seems to be a very kind of a defining form of cultural capital in the United States in the last 20 years. About 25 years ago or so, a number of scholars noticed that Americans in their taste for cultural goods, say music or clothes or food is another good one, and we see this quite a bit now, is that Americans are becoming less and less isolated in their taste and more omnivores, which is consuming everything, a willingness to try everything, and whether that be try different types of music, try different types of food, all this sort of stuff. This was a really big change. Up until about 30 years ago, there was really some level of kind of closedness of cultural groupings that were often connected with racial and class groupings and even religious groupings. But we've noticed some kind of breakdown so that your average American is much more likely to have some sort of broader taste around cultural goods. Now, this is really interesting for cultural sociologists like us. Sometimes cultural sociologists are seen by other sociologists as wasting a whole bunch of time talking about stuff that's not important to society. But along comes the author of this article, Anything But Heavy Metal, and she kind of starts out from this idea of the fact that we're becoming omnivores, or that we are characterized by what's called omnivorism or omnivorism. And she says, you know what? We should look closely at the patterns of how this openness to different things works. Because, and this is important, because Bourdieu showed us that struggles that are occurring in terms of social power, like brute economic and political power, always have this cultural dimension, or always have this kind of clashing of symbolizing goods. So struggles play out in these two arenas, in the material arena of life as well as the symbolic arena. And of course, Bourdieu talked about that with this idea of cultural capital. Bethany Bryson, who wrote this article, let me write her name here, says, well, let's dig into this pattern of omnivorism and see if really is it seemingly, or is it what it seems to be, which is this great breakdown where we don't see difference and we like everything and we all love each other and get along, or, and this is a good kind of sociological instinct here, or is it covering over a deeper pattern of ongoing symbolic distinction and cultural inequality? Her answer, just to tip my hat, is yes, but what's interesting is how she gets to that answer. So she notes a couple of dueling hypotheses. One, from Bourdieu, as we've seen before, is this idea that if you get more education, your social well, let me draw this out for you on a quick graph. So this is education, this is exclusion. Bourdieu's argument is that the more education you get, the more exclusive you'll become. So this is this whole idea about cultural capital, right? Well, Bryson notes that, hey, people have been studying democracies for a long time, and it actually seems to be the case that the more education you get, the less exclusive you are. So the more you go up on this, it's actually, I guess you could say it's kind of a line like this. It's going in this opposite direction. So the more education you get, the less exclusive you are. So Bryson says, well, which one of these is right? And can we basically dig around with a data set that has a whole bunch of information about choices, cultural choices, to find out? And what she ends up doing is saying there may be this thing that exists which we can call multicultural capital. And so she's staying within Bourdieu's system of thinking, but she's saying that there may be this form of cultural capital that she calls multicultural capital, which is dominant in the United States right now. And she says, in order for this to exist, the possibility that this multicultural capital exists, that people like lots of stuff, or lots of different types of stuff, there needs to be a couple things. One, tolerant. The idea of openness of tolerance must be associated with higher status upper class groups. So there is that condition. We can see that in St. Paul's, right? That place is just swimming, as you'll see in the last chapter, with this idea of openness to all sorts of ideas. Two, she says, we should be able to show that with increasing education, people will show that they're more tolerant and more open to multicultural capital. And three, in a classic Bourdieuian sense, she's going to show us that if there is really such a thing as multicultural capital, it must in some way create distinctions between groups in society. So even though it seems open and tolerant and diverse, it still must somehow be creating distinctions and divisions. So what does she find? Well, I think this is pretty brilliant. She goes to the General Social Survey, which is a classic tool for sociologists to use. There was an element of that survey, I think in 1990 or 1992, that listed like 18 groups of types of music. Heavy metal, country, rap, gospel, jazz, adult contemporary, you name it, they listed it. And for each type they said, how much do you like or not like this? And there was a little scale and people would check the boxes. And she collects all this data together. This is a representative sample of American adults in the United States, and starts going through the data. And she finds a number of things, which is that first off, education increases tolerance. Okay, not surprising. It verified what her hypothesis was. The more education you have in this sample, the less likely you are to exclude more types of music. So less educated people will have less tolerance for a wide range of music. More educated people will have much more tolerance for this range of music. So, so there was those two kind of findings go together as the levels of education vary. However, and this is important, I'll put a big however here, the patterns of what is excluded among highly educated, i.e. the most tolerant multicultural people, is pretty interesting. And to understand how this multicultural capital thing works, we don't look at just what people like, but instead we look at what people don't like. Because remember, for Bourdieu, the distinctions were always, there was not just about what it is that I thought was best or displaying my taste on what was favorite, but by doing so, showing that what you like is not what I like. So what she finds is that persons, highly educated persons, so those who are most tolerant, are most likely to dislike certain types of music. And these were basically musical genres that were connected with lower class groups. So this tended to be rap, gospel, country music, heavy metal. So musical genres connected with lower class groups were those genres most likely to be disliked from the people who are most tolerant. So she's pointing out that even this multicultural capital thing has this element of distinction and showing not liking something, despite the fact that on the surface tolerance looks really great. And she notes that there is some racial element, but with genres such as jazz, for example, because tolerance is often, in the United States in the second half of the 20th century, is often a racial characteristic, so racial tolerance being important. Those genres that are seen as just kind of racial in a general sense, like jazz, are liked by highly educated, tolerant people. But it's the class genres, it's the gospels, the heavy metal, the rap, the country, that are those that are disliked by highly educated people. And so she noticed that some of those genres, for example, rap and gospel, are both minority genres and mostly liked by people of certain racial groups. So she noticed they almost have kind of a double, a potential double fault amongst the most tolerant people because they bring class and racial exclusion together. What her broad conclusion is that educated people might show a multicultural capital. They're the ones that are most likely to like the broadest range of musics, but that there are clear boundaries that even these tolerant people have in which they tend to mostly exclude lower class genres. And so she says that, in a Bourdieuian sense, gives us a really interesting idea that patterns of musical exclusiveness and distinction tell us a lot about what goes on socially. So that in this country, exclusion, at least in the 1980s and 1990s, as intensive racial exclusion has broken down, it's by no means gone. She's shown that there has been some sort of rise or continuing existence of class-based exclusion. And if we can understand those patterns symbolically, how exclusion is happening, it gives us an inkling of what's happening in more kind of arenas of social power and social policies that we can look at. So she has this great example, and you can follow it in Kahn in the last chapter when he talks about the omnivorism of students. She has this great example of showing what seems to be this wonderful thing of no boundaries and open embrace. Actually, when you start to scratch at it and you start to think of cultural processes as processes of distinction and exclusion, you start to see that there's some problems behind those things. So I consider it as kind of a great, within the great line of sociologists, being kind of skeptical about what are these kind of great broad claims of tolerance or multicultural capital, to show that even that as humans and as being part of a society, these processes of distinction and inequality and exclusion are always happening. Now, I assigned a short piece by Bryson in the reader that we have. Please read that. It'll give you the quick overview of her argument. It's a quick summation of the real technical article that she wrote. It'll give you an idea for of what her full argument is. That's it for now. I hope you have a great week, and I'll catch up with you on the other side. Just a few weeks left. Don't give up. And remember, the reading you do now is really helpful for that final paper. So take a look at those instructions. Okay, see you next week. Bye.